I never thought I'd end up falling for someone at an animal shelter. Not that I was exactly looking for love when I signed up to volunteer. Honestly, I just wanted to do something decent with my weekends, get out of my own head for a bit, and maybe, if I'm being honest, pet some dogs. What I didn't expect was that the same guy showing up every Saturday morning with his slightly crooked smile and these hands that somehow looked both gentle and strong would end up feeding more than just the shelter animals. So yeah, the first time I saw him, I was elbow deep in cleaning out a cage, cursing under my breath, because this one mutt had clearly been hiding a mud bath somewhere nearby. I glanced up and there he was, standing by the entrance holding a crate with a tiny, trembling kitten inside. It was like he walked into the room and everything around him just slowed down a bit. He had this calm, easy way about him, like he'd been volunteering there forever. I learned later he had, but that morning I just thought, okay, who's that guy? His name was Jamie. He looked up and caught me staring, gave me this quick, half smile that felt like a secret invitation or a challenge. I wasn't sure which yet. Then he moved over to the feeding station, the one place I wasn't supposed to be, because it was Jamie's territory. I figured he was the kind of guy who probably had a soft spot for animals. Maybe even $1 million heart wrapped in a messy flannel shirt and worn-out sneakers. I remember that morning vividly because the shelter was colder than usual, the kind of cold that sneaks into your bones. But Jamie showed up with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed me one without saying a word, just that little smile that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I belonged there. That tiny gesture, sharing a hot drink, was when I realized this was going to be different from every other volunteer gig I'd half-heartedly signed up for. What I didn't expect was that the most awkward, fumbling, and downright embarrassing moment of my life would happen right there between the cat cages. I was trying to feed one of the shelter dogs this massive golden retriever with the saddest eyes I'd ever seen, and I ended up dropping the entire bowl of food on my shoes. Jamie laughed, not in a mean way, but the kind of laugh that made it impossible to feel embarrassed. And then, out of nowhere, he fed me. No, not literally with a spoon or anything like that, but when he slid me a sandwich he'd brought from home, saying, "You look like you need this more than the dogs do," I felt like I was suddenly part of something way bigger than myself. I'd never had anyone do that for me before. Just plain simple care, no strings or expectations. So there we were. 2 guys volunteering to save the lives of animals, and somewhere between the spilled dog food and shared sandwiches, something started to grow between us that neither one of us could ignore. But of course it wouldn't be that simple, right? Because where there's shelter animals and volunteer crushes, there's always a little bit of chaos waiting around the corner, and that's when the real story began. So after that day with the spilled food and the sandwich, Jamie and I started falling into this strange rhythm. We'd show up at the shelter at the same time every Saturday, and somehow the chaos of barking dogs, meowing cats, and endless cleaning turned into this kind of shared secret. It was weird in the best way. I found myself looking forward not just to the animals, but to seeing him. The way he'd tuck his sleeves up, the way his smile got a little softer when he talked about a particularly stubborn rescue dog, and how he didn't seem to mind my terrible jokes, even when they were really bad. I'm not usually great at picking up on signals. Hell, most of the time, I can't tell if someone's just being friendly or actually interested in me. But Jamie had this way of making me feel like, maybe this time, I wasn't completely invisible. There was this one afternoon, about 3 weeks after we first met, when I caught him watching me while I was trying to calm down this hyperactive terrier. I wasn't doing a great job, if I'm honest. The dog was jumping around like it was training for a dog park Olympics, and I was slipping on muddy paw prints, trying to keep up. Jamie just leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smiling like he found the whole spectacle amusing. "Need a hand?" he asked, stepping over. "Yeah, if you don't mind," I said, trying not to sound desperate. He jumped right in, and between the 2 of us, we finally got the dog to sit still for more than 10 seconds. As we caught our breath, Jamie looked at me and said, "You're kinda hopeless." I laughed, which was probably the most honest thing I did all day. I get that a lot. From there, it was like the walls I had built around myself started to crack just a little. I told him about my job, something in tech that I mostly liked, but that could be a grind. And he talked about how he'd switched careers recently, leaving a corporate job to work at a nonprofit that helped kids with special needs. I was impressed. He seemed like the kind of person who actually followed his heart, even when it was scary. One Saturday, we ended up locking eyes over the kennel doors during one of the volunteer breaks. The shelter was quiet for once. All the animals were settling down after their lunch. Jamie had this look on his face like he was about to say something important, but then he just smiled and said, "Hey, do you want to grab a coffee after this?" On me. And I wanted to say yes so badly that I almost didn't hear the question right. Yeah, sure. I managed. That coffee date wasn't anything fancy, just a small cafe down the street, but it was the first time I got to see Jamie outside the shelter, without fur and the smell of dog shampoo hanging in the air. We talked about everything: movies we liked, terrible first dates, the kind of music that made us nostalgic. Somewhere between the third sip of coffee and him telling me about his childhood dog, I felt this warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the hot latte in my hands. After that, things started to shift. We were texting during the week, joking about shelter stories or sharing pictures of our own pets. He sent me a picture of his dog, a goofy golden retriever named Murphy, who looked like he had zero chill. I sent back a picture of my cat, a grumpy tuxedo named Gus, who seemed to think he ran the place. It was silly, but it felt real, like we were slowly making space for each other in our lives without rushing or forcing anything. But here's the thing about moments like that: they're fragile. Last week, Jamie told me he was thinking about moving to a different city in a few months. It wasn't unexpected. He'd mentioned his job was kind of up in the air. But hearing it out loud hit me harder than I thought it would. Suddenly, all those easy Saturday mornings and shared sandwiches felt like maybe they were on borrowed time. I didn't say much right then, just nodded and told him I understood. But inside, my stomach twisted in a way I hadn't felt in years. Like I was standing at the edge of something I didn't want to fall off of, but couldn't stop myself from stepping closer to. So now, I'm sitting here, waiting for the next Saturday, wondering how many more last Saturdays we get before that city becomes a line on a map and Jamie becomes a memory. I'm not sure if I'll tell him how I feel, or if I'm just going to keep pretending that feeding dogs and swapping sandwiches is enough. But maybe, just maybe, that's the point. Sometimes love doesn't come in grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it's just two people showing up, over and over, even when the future feels uncertain. And maybe that's enough to start with. Saturday came around again, and I was nervously pacing outside the shelter before my shift started. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your breath visible, and for the first time, I wasn't sure what to expect when Jamie showed up. I kept going over the conversation we'd had at coffee, the way he'd said, "I'm thinking about moving," like it was just a passing thought, but to me, it felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't want to mess things up, but I also didn't want to keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. When Jamie arrived, his usual easy smile was there, but his eyes looked a little tired, like he'd been wrestling with something heavy all week. I debated whether to say something right away or just dive into the usual task of feeding and cleaning. In the end, I went with honesty. "Hey," I said as he handed me a leash for one of the shelter dogs. "Can we talk? Like, really talk?" He looked surprised but nodded, following me to a quiet corner of the shelter away from the barking and meowing chaos. I swallowed hard and said, "About the move. You said you might leave soon. I'm guessing that's not an easy decision." Jamie sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No, it's not. I love this place. And, well, I love the people here too. You especially. But the job opportunity is something I can't pass up. It's what I've been working toward for years. I felt my throat tighten. I get that. I just wish you'd told me sooner. Or maybe told me how much it matters." He looked at me, his eyes softening in a way that made my heart ache. I wasn't sure how to say it. And honestly, I wasn't sure you'd care. "Of course I care," I said, stepping a little closer. "I just don't want this to end." Jamie reached out and gently touched my arm. Neither do I. For a moment, the noise of the shelter faded away, and it was just the two of us, standing in a quiet bubble where everything else didn't matter. I realized then that this wasn't just about a guy in a move, it was about something deeper, something I hadn't let myself admit until that second. We spent the rest of the shift working side by side, but the air between us was different, charged, hopeful, and terrifying all at once. Jamie started telling me more about his plans, the city he was moving to, the work he'd be doing, and the loneliness he expected to feel. I told him about my own fears of being left behind, of losing a connection that had somehow become the best part of my week. When it was time to feed the dogs, Jamie did something I didn't expect. Instead of grabbing a bowl for himself, he took mine and said, "Let me feed you this time." I laughed, shaking my head. "You're terrible at metaphors," but he just grinned and said, "Maybe, but I'm serious. Let me take care of you for a change." And so, as I sat on the floor by the kennel, Jamie knelt in front of me, carefully handing me a piece of a sandwich he'd packed that morning. It was simple, but in that moment, it felt huge, like a promise that whatever happened next, we'd try to hold on to what we'd found. After our shift, we wandered outside, the sun just starting to dip below the horizon. Jamie stopped and looked at me, his voice low and steady. "Look, I don't know what the future holds, but I want to try. With you." I smiled, feeling a mix of relief and excitement I hadn't felt in a long time. "I want that too." We stood there for a second, the world around us fading into the background. And even though I knew the next few months would be uncertain, maybe even painful, right then it felt like we had something worth fighting for. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept replaying the moment Jamie fed me that sandwich. How small and simple it was, but how much it meant. I realized love isn't always about grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes, it's about showing up, being vulnerable, and feeding each other through the messy, unpredictable parts of life. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of love that lasts. The next few weeks felt like walking a tightrope stretched between hope and fear. Every Saturday, Jamie and I met at the shelter like clockwork, sharing tasks and stories, and those quiet moments where words weren't necessary. But beneath it all was this unspoken question hanging between us. How much time did we really have? One Saturday, the shelter was unusually busy. A litter of puppies had been dropped off that morning, and the place was chaos. Kennels overflowing, volunteers scrambling, dogs barking like they were auditioning for a canine choir. Jamie and I were assigned to the puppy area, trying to keep the little guys from chewing through everything in sight. At one point, a tiny beagle puppy wriggled free from its enclosure and darted toward me, slipping between my legs and yipping excitedly. I bent down to scoop him up when Jamie came around the corner, laughing. "Looks like you've been adopted," he said, watching me juggle the squirming ball of fur. I grinned, feeling light despite the stress of the day. "I think I'm the one who just got a new best friend." Jamie crouched beside me, and for a moment, I noticed how close we were, our knees almost touching, the smell of his cologne mixing with the shelter's familiar scent of dog shampoo and floor cleaner. I wanted to reach out, to close the gap that had been there between us for weeks. Instead, I just smiled and said, "You think you could handle a puppy?" He gave me that crooked smile again, the one that made my heart do weird flips. "Maybe. If you're in." The puppy yipped again like he was agreeing with Jamie, and I laughed, feeling a little spark of something like possibility. Later that afternoon, after the shelter had quieted down, Jamie and I sat on the front steps, sharing a couple of granola bars I'd brought along. We talked about everything and nothing. Old movies we loved, lame jokes, childhood memories. The sun was warm on my face, but I felt a chill in my chest when he brought up his move again. "I had a call from HR today," he said, voice low. "They want me to start in 2 months. 2 months. It sounded so close and yet so far away, like an expiration date hanging over us. I wanted to ask him if he was nervous, scared, excited, but I just nodded and said, "That's sooner than I thought." Jamie looked over at me, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. "Yeah, me too." We sat there in silence, the weight of the future pressing down on us. Then he surprised me by saying, "I don't want to stop seeing you. Not yet. Can we see where this goes? Even if it's just for a little while." My heart thudded. I want that, more than anything. We shook on it, like a pact between two guys who knew the odds weren't great, but were willing to try anyway. The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments and quiet confessions. Jamie taught me how to read the subtle signals dogs give when they're scared or happy, and I showed him my favorite hiking spots nearby. We made playlists for each other, traded embarrassing stories, and spent late nights texting about everything, from trivial stuff to the fears that kept us awake. One night, after a late shift at the shelter, Jamie surprised me by inviting me over to his place. It was small and cozy, filled with books and pictures of dogs and framed postcards from trips he'd taken. He made coffee, and we sat close on his couch, the air thick with something unsaid. Finally, he looked at me and said, "I know this might be crazy, but I want to try being together. Properly, even if it's just while I'm here." I felt like I'd been holding my breath my whole life and just finally exhaled. I'm in, no matter what. That night, lying next to him, I realized how much I'd been missing, how much I'd been afraid to let someone in. But with Jamie, it felt different. Real. Scary, yes, but real. The countdown to his move had begun, but instead of feeling like an ending, it felt like a beginning. A few months to hold on to something that mattered, to see what could be built even when the future was uncertain. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The weeks after that night felt like a mix of everything. Excitement, nervousness, and this weird bittersweetness that I wasn't quite ready to name. Jamie and I started officially dating, if you could call it that, without both of us laughing at the cliche. We kept it low-key, meeting mostly at the shelter, grabbing late-night pizza after shifts, and sneaking in quiet dinners at his place where Murphy, his golden retriever, always tried to steal the spotlight. One Saturday, a few weeks before his move, we were working in the cat wing. The shelter had just gotten a shy tabby named Leo, who barely ventured out of his little hidey box. Jamie crouched beside me, whispering, "Watch this." He pulled out a small ball and rolled it gently across the floor. After a few moments, Leo's big green eyes followed the ball, and he batted it with a tentative paw. Jamie grinned. "See? Sometimes love is just being patient with someone until they're ready to come out of their shell." I smiled, watching the way Jamie's eyes lit up with pride. "You're really good with them." "Only because I learn from the best," he teased, elbowing me lightly. Those little moments were everything. The easy banter, the shared glances, the feeling that, for once, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But underneath, there was always that shadow of time ticking down, reminding us that soon Jamie would be packing up and moving hundreds of miles away. One evening, just after we'd closed the shelter, Jamie and I sat on the roof of his apartment building, watching the city lights flicker on like stars fall into earth. Murphy lay curled up between us, snoring softly. "I'm scared," I admitted, breaking the comfortable silence. Jamie looked over, eyes reflecting the city's glow. "Yeah, me too." It felt strange to admit something so vulnerable, but with him, it was easier. "I don't want this to be just a summer thing or some kind of placeholder before you leave." Jamie reached for my hand, holding it firm. "It won't be. I want this to mean something, whatever time we have." The honesty between us was rare and raw. I realized that this wasn't just about two guys thrown together by chance at an animal shelter. It was about finding someone who saw me, really saw me, and was willing to hold on despite the uncertainty. The weeks blurred into a strange kind of normal. We celebrated small victories, like when Leo finally came out from his box to curl up on Jamie's lap. We navigated tough conversations about the future and what long distance might look like. And we laughed. God, we laughed a lot, because sometimes that was the only way to keep the fear from swallowing us whole. But the closer Jamie's move got, the harder it became. There was a night when we sat in his living room, surrounded by half-packed boxes, and neither of us wanted to say goodbye yet. Jamie looked at me, voice thick with emotion. "I don't want this to end like a story we just tell people about once upon a time." I swallowed the lump in my throat. Me neither. We stood up, and without thinking, I pulled him into a hug. It was tight and shaky and somehow perfect. "Whatever happens," I whispered, "thank you for feeding me. Not just the sandwiches, but everything." Jamie smiled against my shoulder. "You did the same for me." We held on to that moment, knowing it might be the last like it for a while. The day he left was surreal. I drove him to the station, trying not to cry while Jamie joked about how I was going to miss the shelter dogs as much as him. We promised to call, to visit, to try. And as he boarded the train, I realized that some endings weren't really endings at all. They were just the start of a new chapter. Walking back to my car, I felt a strange mix of loss and hope. The shelter would still be there, the dogs and cats waiting for their forever homes. But now, so was this new feeling inside me, a kind of love that had started with a sandwich and a smile, and might just survive the distance. Life has a funny way of surprising you. I signed up to volunteer because I wanted to help animals, but what I got was a reminder that sometimes the best rescue is finding someone willing to feed your heart when you least expect it. The first week after Jamie left was rough. The kind of rough where you find yourself staring at your phone, debating whether to text him for the 100th time, only to convince yourself he's probably busy or tired, or maybe just not feeling it anymore. I told myself to be patient. The long distance was tough and feelings needed time to settle, but man, it didn't make sitting on my couch alone any easier. I went to the shelter that Saturday, like I always did, but it felt different without him there. The noises, the smells, even the chaotic energy, it all seemed muted somehow. I kept catching myself looking toward the door, half expecting him to walk in with that crooked smile, holding a crate or a coffee or maybe just some ridiculous story about one of the shelter dogs. Instead, I found Murphy waiting by the gate, tail wagging like crazy. Jamie had left him with the shelter's foster program, thinking it'd be easier for Murphy to stay close by than to uproot him for the move. I knelt down and scratched behind Murphy's ears, and the dog licked my face like he was trying to say, "Hey, I'm still here and so is Jamie." I realized then that even if Jamie wasn't physically around, there were pieces of him scattered throughout my life in the shelter dogs, in Murphy's goofy grin, in the quiet corners where we shared those moments. Over the next few weeks, texts and calls became our lifeline. We swapped stories about our days, sent pictures of the weird meals we tried to cook, and even had a virtual movie night where we hit play at the same time and messaged each other sarcastic comments. It wasn't the same as being together in the same room, but it was something. One evening, I got a call from Jamie out of the blue. His voice was tired but excited. Guess what? I'm coming back next weekend for a visit. I felt my chest tighten in a way that was half relief, half anticipation. No way. Seriously? Yeah. I figured I needed to see you and Murphy and, the whole shelter chaos. We laughed like idiots, making plans for the weekend that suddenly felt like it was the first chapter of a new story instead of the last one. When Jamie arrived, it was like no time had passed. He was still the same guy who'd fed me sandwiches and quiet smiles amid the shelter madness. We picked up right where we left off, but with this new layer of distance and time woven into our connection. That weekend was a whirlwind. Long walks with Murphy, late-night talks on Jamie's couch, even a day at the shelter where we worked side by side, reclaiming that rhythm we'd had before. But beneath the laughter and easy banter, there was an unspoken question hovering: how long could this last? How do you build something when the future feels so uncertain? On Sunday night, as Jamie packed his bag to head back, I pulled him aside. "Hey," I said, heart pounding. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up, curious. "Are we doing this? Like, really trying? Because I don't want to waste time if you're not." Jamie smiled softly, his eyes steady. "I'm trying. Every day. But you have to promise me the same." I nodded, feeling a mix of hope and fear. "I promise." We held each other for a long time before saying goodbye, and as he walked away, I felt something inside me shift. Long distance pleased Meade, no doubt, but the fact that we were willing to fight for this, no matter how messy or complicated, made it worth it. In the months that followed, we kept this up. Visits, calls, texts, and plans for the future. We talked about possibilities. Maybe I'd find a job in his city, or he'd come back. We didn't know yet, and that was scary. But we had each other, and that was enough for now. Looking back, I never imagined volunteering at an animal shelter would lead me here, falling for a guy who showed me how to be vulnerable, who fed me more than just sandwiches, who made me believe in something real again. Life's funny like that. You think you're just signing up to help animals, and then someone shows up and feeds your heart instead. And as I sit here, waiting for our next call, I can't help but feel grateful. Because sometimes love comes in the most unexpected places, and sometimes it's the thing that saves you when you least expect it. After nearly a year of this back and forth, the distance, the visits, the late-night calls, something finally clicked. Not in a dramatic, movie-style grand gesture, but in the quiet, steady way that real life often works. I got a job offer in Jamie's city, a modest gig, nothing flashy, but enough to make moving possible. When I told him, his laugh on the phone was like sunshine cutting through months of gray skies. So, a few months later, I packed up my life and drove across state lines, my heart pounding with that weird mix of excitement and nerves. Jamie met me at the train station, and for a second, it was like all the time, and miles between us dissolved. We didn't need words, just a look, a smile, and that crooked grin I'd come to know so well. We found a little apartment not far from the shelter where it all began. It was small, a bit messy, and filled with the scent of Murphy's dog shampoo and my overcooked dinners. But it was ours. Somewhere between unpacking boxes and figuring out the city, we built a quiet life that didn't need to be perfect to feel right. One evening, after a long day working at the shelter, this time side by side, not miles apart, we sat on the couch, Murphy lying between us, and Jamie looked over with that same soft smile. "You know," he said, "I never thought volunteering would lead me here." I chuckled. "Me neither. But I'm glad it did." He paused, brushing a stray hair from my forehead. "Thanks for sticking around, for feeding me, even when I didn't know I needed it." I reached out, squeezing his hand. "You did the same for me, and I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, I realized that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks or sweeping declarations. Sometimes, it's a sandwich shared in a shelter, a quiet promise to try, and the courage to show up again and again. It's messy and uncertain and utterly human, and that's exactly why it's worth holding on to.